Russia is burning, not metaphorically, literally. At a Federal Security Service compound in occupied Kherson Oblast, a building that was supposed to be one of the most protected nodes in the entire southern Russian occupation network was reduced to a smoking shell. Around 100 Russian troops killed or wounded in a single deliberate surgical operation. A Panzer S-1 air defense system, a system Moscow paid up to $20 million for, vaporized in the same strike. The FSB, the agency that built its entire identity on being the eyes, the ears, the iron grip of the Russian state inside occupied Ukrainian territory, just watched its own headquarters disappear in front of its own cameras. And the man giving the order was not a general on a front line. It was the Security Service of Ukraine, the SBU, through its Alpha Special Operations Center, executing a precision strike that President Volodymyr Zelensky himself confirmed on May 21st. Let that sink in for a moment. The FSB in occupied territory, with layered air defense, with a Panzer parked outside, killed and wounded by the hundred. And the broader story is even more uncomfortable for Moscow than the headline suggests, because this is not a story about one building in Kherson Oblast. It is not a story about one Panzer. It is not even a story about 100 Russian losses. This is a case study in the structural collapse of Russian counterintelligence doctrine inside occupied Ukraine. This is a case study in why the FSB, after nearly 4 years of war, still does not know how to protect itself from the very service it was created to defeat. And before this analysis is finished, you will understand not just what happened in Kherson, but why it was always going to happen, and why the next strike like this is already being prepared somewhere on a map Moscow cannot see. Pull the lens back. To understand the magnitude of what just occurred, you have to rewind to the assumptions Russia carried into the occupation of Kherson Oblast in 2022. When Russian forces took the regional capital on the 1st of March that year, the FSB moved in behind the army with a doctrine inherited almost unchanged from Soviet counterintelligence. Occupy, filter, survey, intimidate, build a network of informants, crush partisans, hold the territory through fear. That doctrine assumed three things. It assumed that the occupied population could be terrorized into passivity. It assumed that Ukrainian special services could not reach across the front line in any sustained way. And it assumed that hardened command nodes, especially FSB nodes, sat behind enough layers of air defense and operational secrecy to be effectively untouchable. Every one of those assumptions has now been falsified. Not gradually, not partially, catastrophically. When Ukrainian forces liberated the city of Kherson in November 2022, the Russian occupation retreated to the east bank of the Dnipro River. Moscow told itself that the river was a natural barrier, that the wide exposed crossings would protect the rear, that the swamps and the irrigation channels and the salt flats and the Arabat Spit would buy time and depth. The FSB built its new headquarters network on the assumption that distance from the front line equaled safety. And for a while, on paper, that looked true. But here is the hidden military variable that Russian planners did not internalize. Distance only equals safety when the enemy cannot see you. The moment your enemy can see you, distance equals targeting time. Distance equals trajectory planning. Distance equals the calm, patient, methodical construction of a kill chain. And by 2024, by 2025, and certainly by the spring of 2026, Ukraine had built one of the most effective reconnaissance strike complexes in modern military history. Satellite intelligence from Western partners, domestic drone-based ISR, signals intelligence on Russian communications, human intelligence networks rebuilt inside occupied territory by the very services Russia was trying to suppress. The FSB headquarters that was destroyed this week was not destroyed because Ukraine got lucky. It was destroyed because Ukraine had been watching it for weeks, possibly months, building the pattern of life around it, mapping the air defense, identifying the personnel rotations, and waiting for the operational window. This is not a story about a drone strike. This is a story about a nervous system. And the FSB just lost a ganglion. What happens next changes everything in Russian rear area planning. And let me walk you through what this actually means at the strategic level. The Panzer S-1 that was destroyed in this operation is not a small loss. The Panzer is the workhorse of Russian short-range air defense. It is the system Moscow uses to protect headquarters, air bases, oil refineries, command posts, and high-value personnel. Each unit, according to the figures Zelensky cited and which align with publicly known export valuations, runs up to $20 million. But the dollar number is the least interesting part. The interesting part is what the Panzer represents doctrinally. It represents the Russian belief that you can protect a fixed target with a fixed defender. Park a Panzer outside your headquarters. Put a radar dome on the roof. Run a few patrols. Call it secure. That doctrine is dead. And the FSB just discovered it is dead, the same way the Black Sea Fleet discovered it, the same way the strategic bomber bases at Ingalls and Olenia and Belaya and Ukrainka discovered it, the same way Russian oil refineries from Ryazan to Samara to Volgograd discovered it, the same way the Kerch Bridge discovered it twice. There is now a consistent, repeated, documented pattern in this war, and the pattern is this. Every Russian asset that Moscow has called untouchable has been touched. Every Russian fortress that Moscow has called impregnable has been penetrated. Every Russian defensive system that Moscow has called layered has been peeled back, one layer at a time, until the target inside is exposed. This matters enormously because the FSB is not just any target. The FSB is the institutional memory of Russian state power inside occupied Ukraine. It is the agency that runs the filtration camps. It is the agency that hunts partisans. It is the agency that maintains the registry of who is loyal, who is suspect, who has disappeared. When you destroy an FSB headquarters and you kill or wound roughly 100 personnel in a single operation, you do not just kill operators. You kill files. You kill informant networks. You kill the human relationships that took years to build under occupation. And it gets even more serious from here, because every officer who survives that strike now has to ask himself a question Moscow does not want him asking. If they could find this building, what else can they find? That question is the real weapon. The kinetic damage is recoverable. Buildings can be rebuilt. Personnel can be replaced. Panzers with effort and money can be redeployed. What cannot be replaced is the psychological certainty that being in an FSB uniform inside occupied Ukraine means being safe. That certainty died in Kherson Oblast this week, and it died publicly, with video evidence on the president of Ukraine's own Telegram channel, watched globally within hours. Now pull the lens back again because the larger pattern is even more damning. This Kherson strike does not exist in isolation. It is part of a documented escalation of Ukrainian deep-reach operations against Russian intelligence and command infrastructure that has been accelerating throughout 2025 and into 2026. At the beginning of May, Ukrainian drones struck an FSB facility in occupied Crimea. Ukrainian drones have repeatedly hit FSB headquarters and counterintelligence nodes on the Arabat Spit near Henichesk. The Sever Akhmat training facility in occupied Donetsk was struck, with approximately 65 Russian cadets reported killed in a single Snizhin operation. Russian Grad systems, artillery pieces, armor, ammunition depots in Zaporizhzhia have been hit in coordinated FPV drone swarms. Russian naval aviation, air defense radars, drone production facilities, and logistics hubs have all been targeted in the same operational tempo. The numbers compound. Ukrainian drone commander Robert Brovdy has publicly forecast that Ukrainian drones alone will inflict over 34,000 Russian casualties by the end of May 2026, and that excludes losses from artillery shelling. Independent estimates from European institutes put total Russian permanent losses since February 2022 at approximately 1.2 million, with more than 500,000 of those killed. Read those numbers slowly. 1.2 million Russian casualties, 500,000 Russian dead. And inside that catastrophe, the FSB, the most politically powerful security service in the Russian state, cannot protect its own headquarters in a region Russia claims to have annexed into the Russian Federation itself. This is not a war Russia is fighting well. This is not a war Russia is fighting competently. This is a war in which the foundational doctrines of Russian state security, doctrines that have governed how Moscow projects force into occupied territory since the Soviet era, are being systematically dismantled by a country 1/4 its size, 1/10 its GDP, and a fraction of its population. And the dismantling is not happening despite Russian air defense. The dismantling is happening through Russian air defense, around Russian air defense, over the heads of Russian air defense. The Panzer burned next to the FSB building. It did not save the FSB building. That is the entire story of Russian rear area security in 2026, compressed into a single image. What is the real question then? The real question is not whether Ukraine can hit FSB headquarters. Ukraine just demonstrated that it can. The real question is what this means for the durability of Russian occupation as a political project. Because occupations do not collapse when frontline armies retreat. Occupations collapse when the security apparatus that holds the rear stops feeling secure. When FSB officers stop volunteering for rotations into occupied territory. When informant networks dry up because informants stop believing the people they are informing for will live long enough to protect them. When local collaborators look at a smoking FSB headquarters and quietly start preparing exit plans. That is the social mechanism by which occupations dissolve from the inside, and Ukraine just accelerated it by one very public, very deliberate strike. And let me be clear about something else. The Security Service of Ukraine did not pick this target by accident. The SBU's Alpha Special Operations Center is not a unit you assign to nuisance raids. Alpha is Ukraine's elite counterterrorism and special operations element, and the targets it strikes are selected at the highest political and military levels. When Alpha hits an FSB headquarters, it is a message. The message is institutional. The message is the SBU telling the FSB, agency to agency, service to service, that the war between these two intelligence services has a clear leader and a clear loser. That message will be read inside every Russian security service barracks, every counterintelligence directorate, every regional FSB office from Kaliningrad to Vladivostok. It will be read by every officer who has been told for years that the Ukrainian services are inferior, disorganized, penetrated, and ineffective. It will be read, and it will not be believable anymore. What happens next changes everything in the calculus of Russian rear area defense, and here is why. Moscow now has to make a choice it has been avoiding. Either it pulls FSB headquarters deeper into rear areas, which means surrendering operational control over occupied territory, which means weakening the occupation, which is exactly what Ukraine wants. Or it pours more air defense around existing FSB nodes, which means stripping air defense from somewhere else, which means leaving other high-value targets exposed, which is also exactly what Ukraine wants. There is no third option. There is no version of this where Russia keeps the occupation tight and the rear secure simultaneously. The forces required to do both no longer exist in the Russian order of battle in 2026. They were spent in Avdiivka, in Bakhmut, in Vovchansk, in Pokrovsk, in Toretsk, in the meat wave assaults that have defined this war for 2 years. This is the moment. This is the doctrinal moment where the structural failure becomes undeniable. Russia built its theory of victory in this war on 3 pillars: mass, time, fear. Mass meant overwhelming Ukraine with manpower and shells. Time meant outlasting Western patience. Fear meant terrorizing the occupied population into passivity through the FSB and its associated security organs. The first pillar, mass, has cost Russia more than 500,000 dead. The second pillar, time, has been undermined by Ukrainian deep strikes that bring the war back to Russian territory daily. And the third pillar, fear, just took a direct hit in Kherson Oblast. When the agency of fear cannot protect itself, fear stops being a usable weapon. Pull the lens back one final time because the historical judgment here is brutal. History will record that the Russian Federation, the inheritor of the Soviet Union's vast security apparatus, the state that produced the KGB and the GRU and the FSB and the SVR, the state that built its self-image on intelligence supremacy, was outmaneuvered, outpenetrated, and outhunted by a country it spent decades dismissing as a province. History will record that in May 2026, the SBU's Alpha Special Operations Center destroyed an FSB headquarters with surgical precision while Russian air defense watched, and that this was not an anomaly, but a continuation of a pattern visible since at least 2022. History will record that the Panzer S-1, the Buk, the Tor, the S-300, the S-400, the entire layered architecture of Russian air defense, was insufficient against an adversary that learned, adapted, iterated, and targeted faster than the Russian system could respond. And history will record that the FSB, the agency that prided itself on knowing everything, did not know what was about to happen to it until the building was already on fire. This is the verdict. The Kherson strike is not a tactical incident. It is a case study in the structural failure of Russian counterintelligence doctrine in an era of distributed reconnaissance, precision strike, and asymmetric special operations. It is a case study in why Russian assumptions about depth, fortification, and air defense no longer hold against an adaptive enemy. And it is a case study in why this war, despite all the Russian propaganda about inevitable Ukrainian collapse, continues to produce the opposite result. The collapses are Russian, the adaptations are Ukrainian, the pattern is consistent. The trajectory is clear. The strategic forecast then is this. Expect more strikes on FSB and counterintelligence nodes inside occupied territory in the coming weeks. Expect Russia to reorganize its rear area security posture, probably by pulling sensitive personnel further back, which will degrade the quality of occupation administration. Expect a quiet but real erosion of the FSB's ability to recruit and retain informants in occupied Ukraine, because no one informs for an agency that cannot protect its own buildings. And expect Ukraine to keep selecting symbolic, institutional, doctrinally significant targets, because that is what an intelligent strike campaign looks like when it is run by professionals who understand that you do not just hit the enemy, you hit the enemy's confidence in itself. There is one more layer to all of this, and it is the layer most casual commentators will miss. The Kherson strike happened on a publicly verified timeline, with the president of Ukraine himself confirming it on the same day, with video released, with damage assessment shared, with the destruction of the Pantsir documented. That is not just military operations. That is information warfare executed at the same tempo as the kinetic warfare. Russia, by contrast, has spent years trying to suppress, deny, or delay acknowledgement of similar losses on its own side. The asymmetry of transparency is itself a strategic weapon. Ukraine shows what it does. Russia hides what is done to it. Over time, that asymmetry shifts the global narrative in only one direction, and we are watching that shift in real time. So when you see the headline, Ukraine strikes FSB headquarters, eliminates 100 Russian troops in a major operation in Kherson, understand what you are actually reading. You are reading the doctrinal obituary of a particular Russian theory of war. You are reading the moment when an occupation security apparatus discovered, on camera, that it is no longer the predator in the territory it claims. You are reading a single page in a much longer document about the structural defeat of Russian assumptions by Ukrainian adaptation. And you are reading it before most casual news consumers have processed that the page even exists. That is the value of analysis over coverage. Coverage tells you the building burned. Analysis tells you why the building was always going to burn and which building is next. I will keep tracking these operations as they unfold, because the pattern matters more than any single strike, and the pattern is accelerating. If this kind of analysis is what you came here for, the kind that pulls the lens back from the headline and shows you the structural logic underneath, then subscribe to the channel. Help us reach the next subscriber milestone, because every subscriber strengthens the work and lets us go deeper on the operations that mainstream coverage barely touches. There are more strikes coming. There are more FSB nodes exposed than Moscow wants to admit. There are more doctrines about to fail in public. Stay with us, because those questions do not have simple answers, and the next chapter is already being written somewhere on a map the Russian general staff cannot read. The war is not waiting. Neither is the analysis. I will see you on the next update.